Good afternoon, everybody. This morning we discussed a bit of the truth of suffering and the truth of the origination or the cause of suffering. And now we shall continue from that. Since most of the audience are senior practitioners, so this kind of basic information you might be already knowing, aware of this, and it may be a bit boring, but I considering for there might be many newcomers who are not very well informed about the Buddhist philosophical schools. For them, I am trying to give a basic and preliminary informations. Actually, we are talking about suffering this morning, the noble truth of suffering. As we all know that among the humanity, in the human society, the suffering of physical and the suffering of mind, the mental suffering is more serious than the physical suffering. And our mental sufferings are, if you look closely, fear and frustration. And the frustration comes out of expectations. If you have very high or unreasonable expectations, then which are not fulfilled, then you experience or you get frustrated. So I wanted to say this morning also, I forgot. For the last couple of weeks, you are talking about the course, and you might have a very high expectation from this course, and then you are not getting that, you will want to be frustrated, and that's again a reality of suffering. So that is self-curated suffering that you can avoid. In the Buddhist literature, there are a number of different ways to realizing the truth of suffering. 6 different kinds of suffering, 8 different kinds of suffering, 4 different kinds of suffering. So I am not going into all these details. This morning we discussed about the 8 kinds of suffering because that was directly referred in the Buddha's teaching of first Dhammacakra Parivartana at Sarnath, and then which is summarized in 3 different kinds of suffering, that not mentioned in the Dhammacakka Parvatana Sutta, but most of the other sutras contain that. So we discussed these two, and I think that is sufficient. Someone really contemplate on these sufferings, then she or he can get desire for get rid of this samsara, this psychic existence between the birth and death and so on and so forth. After discussing about the truth of suffering, then the cause of suffering, why Buddha talk about the Four Noble Truth in this particular sequence? First, the realization of suffering, and second, the realization of cause of suffering, then cessation, and then path. This is how we move in practice. Acharya Maitrinath make a metaphor, a patient who is suffering from a very serious disease and how he or she get cured from that disease. In Tibetan language says, Neni Shija, Neji Juni Panjala, Dene Tubja Meni Timber Chavatar. This Sutra Alankar's sentence of a patient who is suffering from some serious disease. First, the person needs to diagnose what is the disease and what is the cause of disease. Unless a proper diagnosis made, he cannot hope for get rid of disease or get cured, and therefore the disease need to be known, what is and what is the cause. Then the health is the ultimate goal, and for that, to eradicate the cause of disease, a medicine is to be taken. Whatever treatment is required, that need to be taken. So similarly, first you realize the reality of the suffering, and second, you need to know the cause of suffering, and thirdly, you have to practice the path similar to taking the treatment or the medicine. Then finally you can get the freedom from the disease. So this is the way he makes this sequence of teaching. All this suffering and pain which we experience day in and day out is neither come without cause, nor any at random cause. It is a creation of our own action, our own deed, positive or negative or neutral, whatever we have done. That karmic force gives you all this pain and misery, and therefore you shall have to comprehend the cause of the suffering And that cause can be summed up in the two categories. The karmic force, that means your own action, mental, physical or vocal action, and that action is being initiated by a mindset, that is the kleshas, the development, mental development or mental obstacles, whatever you may use is actually the kleshas in Sanskrit, the illusion in the mind which is in the form of either attachment or hate. The kleshas can be classified and categorized the 6 root kleshas and the 20 sub-kleshas, but these are very details I am not going to in these discussions, because all of them belongs to either of these 3, ignorance, hate or attachment. Rag, dvesh, moh, this is Sanskrit, the original word. Rag means grasping of something, like something is paste on the wall with a very powerful some picture, and then difficult to take out. That kind of a mindset which holds on some object, that is attachment. And hate can be manifested in the form of anger, in the form of displeasure, in the form of disliking, in the form of a kind of very agitated mind. So it has so many different manifestations. And both of these are caused by the basic mind default, that is the ignorance, not knowing the things properly. So the first 12 ling origination of the psychic existence is the ignorance. How it operates, we can just take a metaphor. There is a darkness, not much light, and a piece of thread or rope is lying on the ground, and you are not able to see it clearly due to the darkness. You just mistook it as a snake. As soon as you misconceive that thread as a snake, a fear comes in your mind. And the fear is caused by the misconception of not seeing the rope or the thread in reality, and it was mentally projected something dangerous, and then fear comes. That fear may cause either to attack on that object by stick, to kill the snake, or run away. Similarly, the ignorance diluted your mind and not able to see yourself as you are. Not seeing yourself as you are, you imaged or designate yourself in the form of ego, in the form of a very solid self, which is not dependent to anything, but which exists inherently by its own nature. So that is the first thing, which creates either attachment or hate to that kind of misconceived self, creates liking, disliking, love and hate, attachment and hate. So by that, then all kind of action is being performed, and from that action you accumulate a positive or a negative energy. I don't know whether the energy word is appropriate, energy or a seed, which is capable of giving result when it meets the required conditions, appropriate conditions, then it gives result. So that is the karma. And that karmic force is stored or accumulated or make an impression on your consciousness. Here I am using consciousness in lieu of vijnana, the Sanskrit vijnana. The continuum of your mind which comes from past life, which remain in this life, which goes in the next life, the continuum of consciousness, a continuum of the vijnana, that is accepted by all the four different schools of philosophy. There is a person designated on the stream or the continuity, although it is transitory, each moment it changes, but there is a continuum. There is no cessation of its continuity. So that is the nature of clarity, nature of mind. That is the individual. On that individual, the karmic force puts its imprint, and when it gets appropriate condition, then it gives result. So that is why the Buddha told about the Dwadash Patisampan, the 12 links or limbs of interdependent origination, how we are all the time reborn, go through all the sufferings, and again go through the death and all this. So the 12 part of interdependent origination or origination of unceasingly in this world, that is very common in every school of Buddhist thought, and you must be very familiar about it. So therefore I am not elaborating, but I am just reminding you the names. The first is ignorance, Tibetan language Maripa, and the second is cognitive action, cognitive action is, I'm not very comfortable, this expression, but many scholars use it for the lieu of doje, sanskar, and then the consciousness, which I already talked, and then the name and form. Here the name and form refers to the, name refers to the four aggregates which belonging to a mind, and the form is referred to the first aggregate, the aggregate of form. So which is technically we call name and form, Ming Su in Tibetan language. Then Chiche, source of perception, and then Rigpa, contact, Surva, feeling, and then Sipa, craving, and Lemba, clinging, Sipa, existence, Kiwa and Gashi, birth, aging and dying. So this comes in a sequence, and through this sequence, how we are trapped, how we are in bondage in each lifetime, whatever we may born in any realm, in each lifetime, we accumulate a karmic force, the second one, cognitive action, for hundreds of thousands of lives to be reborn. So therefore, unless and until you do something drastically to put an end to the activities of the defilement of mind, there is no hope for ending of the cycle of suffering. So because each gives birth to other, and each gives birth to other, and each life you are earning such causes for hundreds of thousands of rebirths. So this is very, very difficult one. So to make it very overly simplified, if we try to make a very overly simplified understanding about this. The first is ignorance. Due to ignorance, you create attachment or hate. Due to the attachment or hate, you perform positive karma or negative karma. Whatever it may be, positive or negative, the karmic force is capable of giving you a rebirth. And that force of giving a rebirth is being stored on the third one, on your consciousness. And that force, when you going to die, the conditions are come around, and that conditions are the craving, clinging, and existence. It comes down below, and due to that, the karmic force accumulated in your mind become active and capable of giving result, and that give result to a rebirth, and the rebirth begin to name and form, and then the source of perceptions are created. Then comes contact. The contact again lead to feeling. Feeling again lead to craving. So it's all recycling, recycling, recycling endlessly. So unless and until the ignorance is removed, there's no way to put this cycle to an end. Cannot break in between. In Sanskrit language we call it anulom and vilom, reverse or the forward. Both the reverse and forward can be put in action from the first one, the ignorance. As long as ignorance is there, all other will come automatically. And no other parts can be eliminated, destroyed or stopped without eliminating the ignorance. Here ignorance means not knowing the self. So this is common to all four schools. Now what is self? That's different, we talk about later on. So commonly we can say not knowing the self is the ignorance. And you dilute or misconstitute, misunderstood, misconceive the self which does not exist. So that is common to all the four schools. So now our basic subject we discuss later on is the four different philosophical schools. So therefore, how the four different philosophical schools begin the difference viewpoint on this first ignorance. What is ignorance? How it is ignorance? And how misconstrue the self, the ignorance of self. Datun Zimba, the self grasping mind, that is the Thome Mariba, the first ignorance. So this we need to analyze a little bit. So before going into analyzing the different schools' concept of wisdom and ignorance, we can generally ask the question to each individual: do you ever try to find the self, who you are? The self is always taken for granted, and somebody calls by your name and your mind is ready to answer. Somebody named Tashi or somebody named Sring, it is just a word. The person is not identical with the name. The names can be changed, the names can be re-put, and you exist before the name exists. You will exist even after going away the name, but at this moment you identify yourself with a particular name, and somebody calls by that name. Your mind carries a concept: this is me, I am, yes, I'm here. Somebody calls, yes, yes, immediately responds. And at that time, there is very solid, inherent, independent, a real, a kind of I, you conceive, you hold upon it. That's difficult to see, but you hold upon, you grasp upon it. So that is the basic question the Buddha asked to his disciples. And the different schools of thought trying to find it, whether it exists or it does not exist. When we receive the teaching of Mahamudra, the first day the Guru used to tell us to go around and find yourself. And we used to go around to find oneself. It's a kind of ritualistic, but it has a real meaning. We never pay attention to find it out. A practitioner must have tried to find it out. Otherwise, ordinary student or lay people never pay attention about oneself. Our attention is always oriented to outside, externally oriented. Just look outside the others and not for oneself. So that's why our ignorance, our grasping on the soul or the self or the Atma become more and more deeper and difficult to eradicate. So from here, all the different philosophical traditions, largely roughly we classify them in the 4 schools, but in the 4 schools, if we go in detail, there are many, many more. Each school has a lot of subdivisions within themselves. All are come out of searching this, questioning this, and looking into this, they have different findings in accordance with their own capability and their own way of rationalizing. So they find different ways. And all of them are perhaps a kind of graduation. If you understand the selflessness explained by the Vibhashikas, Chidamava, it will help to understand the selflessness explained by Sotrantikas, the Indodipa. And if you understand Indodipa's concept of selflessness, you will be able to switch on the Vijnanavadi or Chittamatrata. And if you have a good understanding about Chittamatrata, then you can understand the concept of Madhyamikas more easily. But it doesn't mean that you have to go through all this. I'm talking about just generally, if you understand the lower ones, you will be able to understand the higher ones more easily. But without knowing the Vibhashikas and the Sthantikas and Chittamatrata concept of selflessness, you can directly go into the Madhyamika's concept and you might be able to understand it. But within the Buddhist community, within the Buddhist practitioners, they are aware the 4 different views, and each one of them has sources in the Buddha's own teaching, and each one of them has a value for for practitioners, because Buddha never taught to anyone what he knows. Buddha always taught to his disciples what he or she can understand. In accordance with the capacity, mental capacity of the disciple, he taught in that way. So therefore, all these are belonging to Buddha's instructions, Buddha's teaching, and they are Buddhist view. They are being instructed by Buddha himself, and you can find the original resources of Buddha's words in the canon. So this need to be understood. And each one of them, whether it is correct or whether it is incorrect from the viewpoint of the higher schools, but it cannot be considered worthless or useless, because for its own followers, for its own suitable listeners, that is more valuable than the higher concepts and viewpoints. So this is how the different schools came into being, taught by Buddha and practiced by the disciples, and achieved the freedom by each one of them. Of course, later on they go higher viewpoints, but it contributed for the development of the individuals. Individuals' progress. So this need to be understood. Out of ignorance, the kleshas, the mental defilement, came in existence, and that cause action, positive, negative, or neutral, and which is capable of giving you rebirth and capable of giving result to that next life. So this is how the bondage of karma and klesha comes, and from this all miseries are originated. So the truth of suffering is understood. Now you have to understood the cause of suffering, the action which come out of development of mind and which is caused by ignorance. So that's why we cannot stop the chain of the cycle in between unless and until the source is the root source, ignorance is eradicated. This is a general statement we can make. Now we may look back to the truth of cessation and truth of path can be left for the last day, and from here we entered into discussing the 4 different philosophical schools. The names I already mentioned. The first is called Vivashika, Chidamawa, and the second is Ndodipa, and the third is 2-3 names, Chitimatrata, Sinsampa, or Yogacharya, Nanjur Chipawa, So these two basically famous name, and the fourth is Madhyamika, the highest school, the final school of the Buddhist philosophy. Buddha himself had mentioned that there is four cardinal principles or four outer boundaries in Sanskrit it is called mudras, the Chaturush mudras, that means a seal. Some of the English translators has translated it four seals. That is important if any one of these outer boundaries are violated or transgressed, then the concept or the principle cannot be considered as a Buddhist school of thought. Within that four boundaries, you can differ in so many ways, and yet you can claim your concept or your principles or your philosophy is of a Buddhist philosophy, a Buddhist thought. So, before going into the four different schools of philosophy, we should discuss very briefly, this is also a big subject, we shall discuss very briefly about the four boundaries. It translated in so many different ways, but I found some more commonly used words. The first is Sarva Sanskar Anitya. Sanskrit, the original word is Sarva Sanskar. All compound things are impermanent. Sanskar here means that many parts put together and constructed. So compound is, I think, okay. Dvije thamche metaba in Tibetan word. Dv means put together. Che means curated. What is curated by putting parts together is bound to be impermanent. So anything which is created by cause and conditions can never be a permanent one. Of course, again the concept of impermanence differs from school to school. But basically, whatever is come out of cause and condition, whatever is put together and created, is bound to decay. This is one of the basic cardinal principles. Pre-Buddhist philosophers in India, they very strongly argue the sound is not impermanent. The sound is permanent. Although the sound, the words are, of course, created by compounding things, but it remains permanent because they have to prove the Vedas as uncreated by man, and the Vedas are there as a quality of the space. And you may hear it, you may not hear it. That depends on the capacity of your ear. The sound is always there. And you develop the capacity to catch that sound. Sound is permanent, and it is not transitory. It is always remain there as a quality of the space, and the space is permanent, and the quality of space is permanent. So opposite to this concept, Buddha says, no, all compounded things, entirety of the sanskar are impermanent. They are transitory, and they are bound to disintegrate. So this is the one basic principle for all Buddhist philosophical schools. The second is all contaminated things are suffering. Contamination may not be very accurate. Contaminated. Here contaminated means polluted by some other sources. They are karmic force, they are mental development force. Either it is contaminated by a previous karmic force, or it's contaminated by a negative mind, a negative emotion, mental delusion or mental defaultment. So these things are contaminated, and which is bound to be suffering. It can never be peace or happiness. It's bound to be suffering. Our present aggregates of our form, feeling, cognitive, and consciousness, all these are being contaminated, the default mind and previous karmic force. So therefore it becomes a vessel, or it becomes a source of all kind of misery. So there is nothing which can be called within the realm of the bondage of karmic force and default mind can be called as bliss or happiness or peaceful. All these are misery, pain, due to the cause and the conditions. So the concept of freedom or nirvana is on the basis of the getting rid of, with its root cause of the karma and kilesha, the action and the cause of action, the defiled mind. Unless these two are completely eradicated, you cannot get a freedom. So the different schools' concept of freedom in a realm of concentrative mind There are 8 stages of concentrative mind, but they are still within the bondage of karma and kleshas. So these are not salvation, these are not freedom. So this Buddha wanted to emphasize. So that's why the second cardinal principle is whatever is come out of karma and klesha, that need to be a misery, a suffering. Entire phenomenon, all phenomena are empty and selflessness, or selfless, perhaps. The phenomena can be composed thing or uncomposed thing. There are 2 different things, but whatever it may be, they are bound to be empty of a self-existence, empty of, now here empty and selfless, the 2 words are used a kind of repetitively. The first emptiness means it does not have a different Atma who owns or who controls the other things. And the second selfless refers to it does not have its own self. In the pre-Buddhistic or no-Buddhistic philosophical schools, they do have a concept of a different Atma, different self. The world self and the world Atma or world soul is a very tricky word. We have to use for that portion also which need to be negated, and we also use it for that portion which need not to be negated. So in the Madhyamik school, we say there is no self, but there is a self exists just in name, just in a designation, or just in our day-to-day behavior. So what is exist, what is to be negated, there's very thin, very subtle boundary, and if we go that side, we may fall into the nihilism, and if we come little bit this side, we may fall into the essentialism. Tapyatha and Chevetha, both of them are ends. Little bit come this side, you may fall in. So the Madhyamika, the middle path, is very difficult to follow. So I'm just saying that this expression when we use, we shall have to be careful and where we are using this word, to which we are referring to. So the non-Buddhistic schools, sometimes they make the definition of an Atma. That means the Atma is not the form, no other any aggregates which composed of our existence, the entire existence of any individual is constructed on the basis of 5 aggregates. 5 aggregates belongs to 4 of them as a mind and 1 is as a physical body. Aggregate of form, aggregate of feeling, aggregate of discrimination, and aggregate of compositional factor, and aggregate of the consciousness. On these 5 aggregates of 5 components come together, it makes a person, an individual. So now Buddhist schools says these 5 aggregates are subject of a permanent self, Atman, which is a part of a bigger self, which is called Paramatma. Paramatman, Atman, and then Jivatma, the individual self. So there are 3 categories they make. So that means a self exists independent of all the 5 aggregates on which an individual is designated. Named or designated. So these are the things which are to be controlled and to be used, to be taken as a service to a self which exists entirely different from the 5 aggregates. So when we refer to a shunya, it refers the negation of such a self. There's no different self which controls or which uses or which employs the 5 aggregates of the individual. And selflessness refers there's no self within that 5 aggregates as a one or as a different, both wise. There's no self. So the selflessness also goes in 2 different categories. One is a negation of one permanent, independent. Ta, chik, rawan with da in Tibetan language. Ta means permanent, not transitory. And chi means not many, there's only one. And Rawanchen means independent, not dependent on anything. Negation of such self is one category. The other is not qualifying these 3 attributes, but saying that a self which is of existing in tangible way, and such self is not there. So whatever it may be, the 4th cardinal principle is not accepting a separate independent self or within the component of the 5 aggregates. Either you say the consciousness is self, or the feeling is self, or there is something different within them, a self. So that's to be negated. So these are the four, the basic cardinal principles on which all different kind of Buddhist philosophy can be built up. If you violate any one of these cardinal principles, then your philosophy cannot be considered as a Buddhist philosophy. Otherwise, you can differ each other in so many different questions and so many different concepts. So Buddhist philosophy is very flexible, and in the different ways you can define, you can interpret, you can make positions, or you can deny all positions. So it's quite flexible. So this is the cardinal principles which Buddha himself have taught at many times. Four principles of Dharma, or four cardinal principles of Dharma, or four mudras of the Buddhist philosophy. There are many different names which may call this. So this is the boundary line within which you can make so many different philosophical schools. Now coming to four existing schools of Buddhist philosophy, there are a lot of debate whether some of these schools does violate the four cardinal principles or does not violate the four cardinal principles. Because there are some school which is named as Vasikiputra. It is named after a place. In Tibetan it's called Nemapuvidipa. They conceive a self which is neither permanent nor impermanent, nor self, no other, and a thing which cannot be described by words. Kachi tinyi shenyi ta meta laso jume kansa zeyud, but exist in substantially or tangibly. So it cannot be say it is one with the five aggregates, or it cannot be one with the five aggregates, or it is permanent or impermanent. These are just play of words, and it is beyond all this, and there is a self. So many Tibetan scholars says this philosophy is not a Buddhist philosophy. It should be considered outside of Buddhist philosophy. And other scholars, mostly belonging to a early period of Kadampa, they says, yes, this is within the Buddhist philosophical school, because the four cardinal principles negates only that self which is conceived by the non-Buddhist people, the permanent, the singular, and the independent, with three attributes, three qualities completed in one. That kind of self, that kind of Atma does not accepted by the Vasikaputras. These details are not very important for present audience, but I am dealing with this because when we proceed further in the different schools, so sometimes we may need to refer to these things. So this is philosophically how the Buddhist philosophical schools can differ with each other, and where there is a limitation and there is no limitation. These informations are, I think, a little bit relevant. Having said that, I think we should look at the chronology, historical development of the four schools. That is very controversial and not yet any authentic history of the sequence, how it come into being, has been very clearly defined. However, I am mentioning the things which I feel comfortable. It may be entirely wrong. You can just argue, or it may be a little bit relevance, whatever it may be. What I feel is that during the Buddha's lifetime, there was no division, or there was no even the names of the schools, philosophical schools, Vivashika, Sutrantika, Yogacharya, Madhyamika. These names are not being commonly used. Of course, Buddha himself used the middle path, or the Madhyamika, Chitmatrata. These are quite often used in Buddha's own words, but in a society, in a Buddhist community, these words are used for particular group of schools. Vivashika and Sutrantika, these two expressions, these two names, I think it is later on coined. There's no sutra, no Buddha's teaching I have found in which these two expressions are being used. Buddha's teaching is so vast, and no one can read properly in one lifetime. So therefore, I cannot say Buddha has never mentioned, but I can only say I never found until now. I may have found in later on. But therefore, I infer that these two words have been coined after Buddha's Mahaparinirvana. And nevertheless, historically, the four schools does not separately exist during Buddha's lifetime, but there were people, there were individuals who have accepting the principles which are later on accepted by Vibhashikas and Sutantikas and Madhyamikas and Chittamatrata. Of course, they are different because, as I have said before, all these are being taught by Buddha himself. So Buddha's lifetime, there were disciples who are suiting for the different four schools where exist, and to them Buddha have taught. But at that time, among the Buddhist Sangha or Buddhist community or the community of philosophers did not put these names to a particular group of people, and which are developed later on. Now, there is another thing we should know, is that the four different schools are generally considered to belonging to two different yanas, the Saravakyan and the Bodhisattva yan, or in other words, the Hinayan or the Mahayana. In Buddhist canon and Buddha's own words, sutras, the yans, the vehicles, are being used quite often. And the common usage in Buddha's teaching is triyana, the three different kind of vehicles. And when we talk about triyana, that refers the first Saravakyan, and the second Patik Buddhayan, and the third Bodhisattvayan. So Triyan means the three different vehicle which leads you to three different destinations. The Saravakyan take you up to the Arahanthood, Dachumbe Kopang, Nyetu Dachumbe Kopang. And this second, Nyetu Dachumbe Kopang, means who have eradicated the mental defaultments, the kleshas with its source, but it did not eradicate the obstacles for omissions, for Sauragyana, knowing everything. Only eradicating the mind defaultment part is eradicated, but that person does not have the wisdom or the enlightenment to knowing everything, to become omniscient. And the second yan is called the Patik Buddhayana. Patik Buddhayana, Ran Sanjay Chitipa, Ran Sanjay and Dachumba, the Arahant and the Patik Buddha, they are equal. There is no difference. But at the time of getting the Nirvana, the Arahanthood or the Patik Buddha, the Arahanthood always come when Buddha's Dharma exists in the world. And the Patik Buddhas come when there is a dark period. The world does not exist, Buddha's teaching. The Dharma does not exist. At that time, the Patik Buddhas come due to past life experience. They get a realization just outside cause, seeing some decay or death. By that conditioning or that cause, they immediately realize the inner things and then get the nirvana at that period. So this is Patik Buddha means the last stage. Do not depend on outside teacher. Patik means the self. Buddha means just like Arahant. It is a little translation or expression limitations. Otherwise, it is referred to Arahanthood alone. And then Bodhisattvayan, which leads to the Buddhahood. So these three vehicles are accepted by everyone. When these three vehicles categorized in two vehicles, then we call it Sharvakyan and Bodhisattvayan, or the other impression is Hinayan or Mahayan. Tikpa meba, tikpa chimbo, nyatuch tiba, chanchu simbe tiba. These are the Tibetan expressions used. Because you must familiar with the Tibetan words, so I'm just using it in order to clarification. So in Buddhism, Triyan is a very commonly used expression. Tuyan is also very commonly used expression. So now the four philosophical schools shall have to identify which yan uses which school, or which school is belonging to which yan. The first two schools, the Vivashikas and the Sutrantikas, are considered to be philosophical school of Saravakyan or Hinayan. Now here we must make a clarification that all Arahants or Patik Buddhas are belonging to Vivashik or Sutrantik school. That's no. From the Madhyamik viewpoint, all Arahants shall have to be belonging to Madhyamik school. But in generally a convenient term, we call it these two schools belonging to Sharvakyan. And the Sutrantikas and the Madhyamikas belong to Mahayana. Again, it does not mean any Sharavak or any Patik Buddha do not belonging to Madhyamik. They are belonging to Madhyamik school, but the Madhyamik school is considered to be developed and propagated by the school of Mahayana, by the vehicle of Mahayana. And the first two are developed by the Sharavakyani people. So that's why we call it, these two schools belong to Sharavakyan and the two schools belong to Bodhisattvayan or Mahayana. So this need to be clearly differentiated and understood. As I mentioned before, during the Buddha's lifetime, there was no clear division as well as definition of different schools. And after Buddha's passing away, and maybe around the 10 of the second council, the council means the recitation of Buddha's teachings, the Tripitaka. And by that time, around the Buddha's passing away, 100 or 110 years, then Vibhashikas and Sutrantikas are clearly differentiated and exist among the 18 different Nikayas of the Buddhist community. Then at that time, Mahayana does not exist until 400 years later, when Nagarjuna appeared and he brought the Mahayana Sutras, chiefly the Paramita Sutras, and promote this sutra as Buddha Vachan. And in the beginning, the entire Buddhist community, including Bhikkhu, Bhikkhuni, lay, Sangh, everybody says this is Nagarjuna's composition and is not Buddha's own teaching. And for about 50, 60 years, this debate was going on. So Nagarjuna and Nagarjuna's successors have to work very extensively to establish, to prove the Mahayana Sutras as original Buddha's teachings. Not long after, the Nikayas came to existence first, and the philosophical schools came to existence later on. After Buddha's passing away, I think immediately after the first council, I think they were using different languages for reciting Patimukha Sutra, that means the Bhikkhu's code of conduct, Bhikkhuni's code of conduct, that is called Patimukha Sutra, Susutharpendo in Tibetan language, and recited in different languages, and that established 4 basic different Nikayas, and later on it further divided into, sometimes some scholars says 18, some scholars says 23, or some scholars says 90 or something. There are different viewpoints, and we need not go into these details. But the 4 basic Nikayas, I think we should know, because this is important for Vinaya tradition, for Bhikkhu Sangha's tradition. Today, in this world, there are only 3 traditions exist. The one is Mool Sarvasvadin Shitamche Yubarmadeva. That is the Tibetan tradition of Bhikkhu ordination. And the second is Satrivivad, and now in the Pali language called Thiravad. The Sanskrit we call it Satvirvad. Satvir Vad Nikaya exists very largely. It exists in Myanmar, Thailand, Sri Lanka, and many other countries as well. The Mool Sarvasvadin exists in Tibet, Mongolia, and in the ancient times in China and some of the other countries. And a small portion of Dharmagupta. Dharmagupta is a sub-Nikaya, not a basic Nikaya. It exists in Taiwan and mainland China, Hong Kong, and Malaysia or Singapore. their ordination lineages still exist. And they also have the Bhikkhuni ordination. Now, His Holiness is trying very hard to find out whether the more Sarvasvadin people can also restore the Bhikkhuni ordination in order to complete the 4 Sanghas. And the Vinaya scholars are working hard for the last many years and not yet able to find a conclusion. Basically, the 4 Nikayas which came into being just after the Buddha's passing away, the first is Mahasangika. Mahasangika is a lineage of Mahakashyap, the just Sangha Nayak after Buddha's passing away. Before Buddha entered into Mahaparinirvana, Buddha appointed Mahakashyap as his successor to lead the Sangha. And he used to recite the Pratimukha Sutra in Prakriti language, Yumiranshimbe Prakriti language, and which later on become the Mahasangika Nikaya. And the Tibetan tradition of Nikaya, more Sarvasvadin, that was that lineage comes from Arhant Rahul, the Siddhartha's son, and he used to recite the Pratimukha Sutra in Sanskrit. So therefore, the entire Vinaya Pitak of Tibet is translated from Mul Sarvasvadin Vinaya Pitak, that is preserved in the Sanskrit language. So we do not have any other Vinaya text from Pali or from Prakriti or any other language. And then the still existing tradition of Sattvivad, the Theravada, is descended from Acharya Kachayan. Kachayan is also direct Buddha's disciple, and he used to recite the Pratimukha Sutra in Pali language, and sometimes it's called Pishach language also. Basically it's the Pali language. And still the Pali Tripitak, the Pali Vinaya Pitak exists in the Theravadic countries. So their Vinaya is being recorded and preserved in the Pali language. Then there is a 4th division is from the Acharya Upali. Acharya Upali, this Nikaya is called Samatika, Samatiya, and this Nikaya used to recite the Pratimukha Sutra in Upper Branch language. But the Upper Branch language, Vinaya Pitak is completely disappeared, not available. A little portion of the Dhammagupta tradition, which is mixed with Sanskrit and Prakriti, little portion is available. And Sanskrit Vinaya Pitak is almost complete. Pali Vinaya Pitak is almost complete. And the 4th Vinaya Pitak is completely disappeared, no more. So this is how the Nikayas and bhikkhu ordination traditions do exist today. So this we need to know, and how many nikayas are being developed after Buddha's passing away, and how many of them survive today. And now it is how important today to try to preserve these existing nikayas in future as well. So that's why I just referring to these things briefly. Buddha's teaching during the first council, first Sankaya in the Rajgiri, just after Buddha's passing away, then all Buddha's teachings were recited and remembered by the Arahantas and compiled it into Tripitak. Tripitak means all the teachings related to Shila, the moral conduct and discipline of Bhikkhu and Bhikkhuni Sangha, Shamanari and Shamanarini Sangha. These instructions are called Vinaya Pitak. And then the second is relating to metaphysics, philosophy, which is dealing with the wisdom, prajna, the three basic education of Buddha, that is Shil, Samadhi, Prajna. And Shil, Samadhi, Prajna, commentary or instructions on Shil is called Vinaya Pitak. Instruction or teaching on Samadhi, that is called Sutta Pitak, and on Prajna is called Abhidhamma Pitak. So, Abhidhamma, Vinaya and Sutra, these two baskets of Buddha's teaching are being categorized or classified according to their contents, their subject. Subject dealing with the Shil becomes Vinaya Pitak. Samadhi, the meditative things become the Sutta Pitak, and the dealing with the Prajna, that talk about the so many categories of the Abhidhamma, that become Abhidhamma Pitak. And Abhidhamma Pitak has a commentary which is called a kind of great commentary, Mahabhash, and on that treatise, there were different viewpoints, and someone says these treatises are not written by Arahantas or Buddha's disciples, but these were Buddha's own teaching, but they have compiled and recorded by the Arahantas. And the other group of people says, no, these are not Buddha's teaching compiled by them, but these are the commentary written on Buddha's teaching by the Arahantas. There are 4 or 5 different Arahantas which are referred to the authors. So largely we can say who consider these treatises as a Buddha Vachan, as Buddha's own teaching, they become Sutrantikas. Sutra is referring to Buddha Vachan, Buddha's teaching, and accepting these treatises as a sutra, as Buddha's Vachan, become a Sutrantika. And people who consider these treatises are not Buddha's teaching but a commentary by the Buddha's disciples, and that become Vibhashikas. So this first two school developed on a small different viewpoint of deciding certain important treatises belonging to a Abhidhamma, whether it is a sutra or whether it is a shastra. Shastra means written by others. And on this different viewpoint, these two basic schools are came into existence, most probably around 100 years or less than 100 years of Buddha's parinirvana. And for the Vibhashiki school, the noted scholars are the Basumitra senior, not Basumitra, the brother of the Asanga. Much more before that there was a Basumitra. And Dhamarachit, Buddhadeva, and Sanghabhadra. Sanghabhadra is from Kashmir. So these scholars have wrote many basic treatises of Vibhashiki school. And then the Sutantiki school, the noted scholars, recorded, today we can refer, is Acharya Kumarat, Shrirat, and Badantarat. There are three Rats, very famous called. These people have written quite extensively on Sutantiki school of thought. But unfortunately today in the Tibetan canon, not only Tibetan canon, in the Sanskrit and Indian language also, we do not have much treatises which exclusively belonging to a Sutantiki school. So Sutantiki school principles have to be searched out from many different treatises. In Tibetan source, some of them contained in the Dignag and Chandrakirti's work, Parmana Samukhya or Parmana Vartik and Parmana Vinishche. In these treatises, they are scattered information about Sutantika is available. And even in Sanskrit, we are not able to find much exclusive treatises. And for the Vibhashikas, the Chidatokje Chimo is available in Chinese language, but not in Sanskrit language. And in Sanskrit language, fragmentations are available. Apart from that, the Abhidhamma Kosha is largely explaining the Vivashikas of Kashmir region. Vivashikas also divided into three subdivisions: the Kashmiri Vivashikas and the Eastern Indian Vivashikas and the Madhya Bharati, the Central Indian Vivashikas. There are three different schools. Abhidhamma Kosha and also Parmana Vartik, we can find a lot of information and references about the Vivashika school. So, the source material of these two schools are now almost disappear, and we have to find it in the Vigyanavad treatises and Madhyamik treatises. When they talk about as opponent of their schools, and they are trying to repudiate, they are trying to dismantle the position of the Vivashikas and Stantikas. They talk about the Vivashikas accept this, and that is not correct. And then sometimes the Sutantikas are talking about this, and this are to be repudiated by this logic or by this reasoning. So, the narration of the opponent's viewpoints largely very sincerely and faithfully explained, but at many times there can be misinterpretations also. So at this moment, in the Buddhist community, we do not have authorities, scholar of authorities, who can talk about the position of Vivashika or the position of Stantikas, particularly when it went into very details of the foundation, the path, or the result or the end. So particularly in the practice of path, because there is no practitioner of Vivashikas and no practitioner of Stantikas do exist anywhere at this moment. So therefore, the details of their path and their practice is almost disappeared. So still we have just the information there was this school, and these schools are very much ancient to the Mayan schools. Now coming back to the basic different position, as I mentioned this morning, we cannot go into the details of the different schools' positions pertaining to their method of meditation, pertaining to their concept of graduate path, and concerning to how to attain the Arahanthood or the Buddhahood, so on and so forth. So, difference of schools are developed just only due to the fact that what is the concept of anatma and shunyata, the negation of atma and the negation of true existence. And what is the ignorance? And what is the opponent of ignorance? So we shall just try to deal with this component and with this question, and that would be easier to deal with, and also less confusion. I don't want to increase your confusion. If not, I cannot any aid to your wisdom or your understanding. I don't want to make more confusion. So I think we shall stop here, and again I would like to repeat that in all Buddhist or no-Buddhist philosophical schools, the basic take-off stage is the concept of self. What is self? As an ordinary person, or as a without entering into any religion or philosophy school, just a lay person, who is conscious of identity, conscious of self-confidence or self-esteem, they do have an idea of person. Even today, in the so-called modern subjects of anthropology, social study, political science, all these at many times talk about what is a person, what is the individual, and which constitutes the people, and so on and so forth. So when we go a little bit beyond to these things, the question of identity, question of self and the other, when we enter into inner world, that means the spiritual world, who is practicing the spirituality, who is in a bondage, who is seeking for liberation. These are very basic and fundamental questions. And everyone needs to look into and inquire into in order to proceed in one's spiritual journey. And then, of course, the practitioner of Mayan or practitioner, particularly in Vajrayana, or in Mahamudra or Dzogchen, then again the search of the self or selflessness, whatever, these are almost same, searching of self or searching of selflessness. So many times goes synonym. And that need to begin from oneself. We should pay attention to this. Body, mind, speech are the form, the feeling, the cognition, the action, or the consciousness. All these are a basis of designating a self, or any one of these aggregates considered to be self, or there is a completely separate self around it. These are very fundamental questions. Without asking these questions seriously and sincerely, then talking about the different philosophical schools as just mental entertainment, and which has no meaning. So we shall have to begin from this simple question: who I am, what is I? Do I exist as unconsciously I conceive now to react to many things? Someone abused to me, I immediately get into anger, and there's a very solid I. He abused me. There's a very clear and very solid and independent I. Does it really exist? Where it exists? How it exists? These all need to be questioned. And from there, then the different philosophical schools has a different way of looking at it and different ways of interpreting them. So, thank you for your attention. We shall stop here. As the watch says, it is over.